Hello everyone, in this video I am going to discuss the story of Ruth in the Bible. According to the Talmud Jewish tradition, the prophet Samuel wrote the book of Ruth. The text itself says nothing of the author, but whoever wrote it was a skilled storyteller. It has been called the most beautiful short story ever written. The exact date the book of Ruth was written is uncertain. However, the prevalent view is a date between 1011 and 931 before Christ. The setting for the Book of Ruth begins in the heathen country of Moab, a region northeast of the Dead Sea, but then moves to Bethlehem. This true account takes place during the dismal days of failure and rebellion of the Israelites, called the period of the Judges. A famine forces Elimelech and his wife Naomi from their Israelite home to the country of Moab. Elimelech dies, and Naomi is left with her two sons, who soon married two Moabite girls named Orpah and Ruth. Later, both of the sons die, and Naomi is left alone with Orpah and Ruth in the strange land. Orpah returns to her parents, but Ruth determines to stay with Naomi as they journey to Bethlehem.
This story of love and devotion tells of Ruth's eventual marriage to a wealthy man named Boaz, by whom she bears a son, Obed, who becomes the grandfather of David and the ancestor of Jesus. Obedience brings Ruth to the privileged lineage of Christ. Let us proceed to the discussion questions, starting with number 1. In line 21, when Naomi said, "I went out full, and the Lord brought me back empty. Why then call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" What made her believe that God had afflicted her? Naomi said this line when she was explaining her predicament to the Bethlehem women. She, her husband, and their two sons had fled the town 10 years ago due to famine and settled in Moab. Famine is an extreme inadequacy and the scarcity of food. Famine is the phenomenon in which it occurs in a vast terrestrial area due to various environmental and biological reasons. Some of the prime reasons are population imbalance, scarcity of water or lack of rainfall, crop failure, and government policies. Now that the famine is over, she returns, but she is missing her husband and sons who died in a foreign land. She realizes that the hardships of the famine are nothing compared to these. As a result, she insists that her friends stop referring to her as Naomi, which means pleasant and lovely, because God has dealt very bitterly with her, and that bitterness has infiltrated every part of her heart, so she says they should call her Mara, which means bitter. Her resentful story includes the irony of her situation. Naomi's stomach was empty when she left Israel because she hadn't eaten anything. However, her hands were full because she had a family. Bethlehem is now brimming with food. The barley is ready to harvest, but her hands have been emptied by the terrible loss. For her, is that why call her Naomi when the Lord has caused her to suffer, and the Almighty has sent such tragedy upon her? Naomi was deeply discouraged. She was certain that the hand of the Lord had turned against her. Number 2. What compelled Ruth to agree with her mother-in-law? What influenced her decision to stay? Is it for the wealth, the land parcel she could have with Naomi? Ruth adored her mother-in-law and had great sympathy for her. Witnessing that she lost her husband and both of her sons, Ruth could not endure to part from Naomi or from the God of Israel that she had come to know. Ruth's decision to commit to Naomi is fraught with uncertainty and loss. Not only must she leave her family, but she recognizes that living in Judah means living among people who would likely regard her as a second-class citizen at best and an enemy at worst. Given the tumultuous history between Moab and Judah, despite this, she does not flinch at the moment. Ruth adores her mother-in-law, and Ruth has come to know and love the one true God through her relationship with Naomi. So Ruth tells Naomi, "Wherever you go, I go, and wherever you stay, I'll stay. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God." Ruth's decision to cling to Naomi and take a leap of faith is only the start of her story. Ruth's devotion to Naomi and God continues once she arrived in Judah. Ruth must have been tempted in her grief to simply give up or to withdraw from the society's scrutiny and judgment. But she does not. Her devotion to Naomi and God is undeniable. She does everything Naomi asks of her and follows God's law. Question number 3. Explain the role of a kinsman redeemer in the redemption of a widow from the state of a deceased relative. What does it represent about Israelite culture? The term kinsman redeemer is a combination of two words. The word kinsman has the same root as what we call next of kin today. It's seen especially in documents involving inheritance like in bank details. It requires information about your closest living relative or beneficiary of an investment. A redeemer is someone who buys back or regains the possession of a property or even a person that was sold to another. Normally, the redeemer pays the price or gives other property worth the value of what is being recovered. A kinsman redeemer is the result of putting those two words together. It means the closest blood relative who willingly regains the possession of something or someone by paying their redemption price. This was practiced in the Israelite culture in which God gave them directions on how to conduct it in the Levitical laws. God provided for the childless widow in the Old Testament through what is referred to as levirate marriage. If brethren dwell together and one of them die and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry outside the family unto a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in unto her, and take her to him as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn whom she beareth shall succeed in the name of his brother who is dead, that his name be not put out of Israel. And the duty of a kinsman was not only limited to the preservation of his relatives and their property. They were also required to ensure that they got descendants in the case of death. This is from Deuteronomy 25, chapters 5 to 6. If someone died without having children, his brother was expected to marry the wife in order to preserve the name of the one who died through the first child born by the wife. These provisions were meant to reduce suffering and to keep poverty and slavery in check. Also, it gave hope to the widows, the poor, and orphans, secured their inheritance, and protected their interests. If someone dies, the widow's nearest unmarried male relative is to marry her, provide her with an heir, and redeem her land so that the widow can be remarried, and the widow is protected from social and economic marginalization or abuse. The covenant land inheritance or state of the dead man is protected and the family has a livelihood. The child born to the widow will be considered the son of the dead man, not the genetic father, thus preserving his name. And lastly, thus the law required that when a relative stepped up to the plate, he would gain by taking the land, but have to provide for the wife and child of the dead man. The kinsman-redeemer system served as the Old Testament's equivalent of a bankruptcy law, and its economic design was entirely to protect and preserve the inheritance of the dead man. In the story of Ruth, Naomi's sons were both dead, and to preserve her husband's name, the kinsman-redeemer also had to marry Ruth since she was Mahlon's childless wife. Ruth obeyed and Boaz did not disappoint, but there was a closer kinsman to them than Boaz, and he deserved to be given the priority. And after they clarified that he was not interested, Boaz gladly redeemed Elimelech's land and married Ruth, the wife of Mahlon. Let us proceed to question number 4. Why does the nearest guardian redeemer refuse his redemption right? What made him reconsider redeeming Naomi's land with Ruth? The nearer redeemer knew this and knew the implications of redeeming the land and Ruth along with it. To him, it meant investing but not having all the returns back to him, for he would also have provided for Ruth and any future children. In fact, it might also mean a dilution of his wealth if there are more children with her. Bible commentators have also mentioned that the Redeemer probably had an existing family, and a new life in Ruth might be a cause of strife in his family. He considered all this and decided against it, and he wanted only the land and did not really want Ruth, and did not want the threat of having to divide up his estate by giving over to his son with Ruth. It was a kind of losing out. He simply was trying to selfishly preserve his name. The passage never ever mentioned his name, and the most natural explanation would be that the writer did not want to embarrass his family in later reading of the book. But it has an ironic literary effect to the reader, in which the man who wanted to preserve his name was never remembered in the end. Moving on to question number 5, explain the significance of a man's custom of giving a sandal to a business partner. According to Israelis, what does it represent in terms of legalization? What probably took place was an ancient custom of releasing a man from his obligation. Speaking of this event, Harold Henry Rowley says that the drawing of the shoe here signified the abandonment of the obligation resting on the kinsman in respect of the property and in respect of Ruth, and it clearly opened the way for Boaz to do what he could not else have done. According to the custom of the day, before Boaz could legally marry Ruth, he needed to get a release from a nearer related kinsman known as a guardian redeemer or kinsman redeemer. Even after this, a named man decided that it was not financially viable for him to redeem Ruth. To make the process legal, Boaz needed to seal the deal with a strange ritual, in a tradition that is perhaps comparable to the modern spit handshake or pinky swear. A shoe was removed and exchanged to ratify the agreement, and this is from Ruth 4, chapter 7 to 8. Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning the redemption and exchange of land to confirm any matter. A man removed his sandal and gave it to another, and this was the manner of attestation in Israel. After this procedure was followed, every bond was broken between the kinsman redeemer and Ruth, and consequently Boaz was legally free to marry her. Kirsten Nelson explains that in order to follow the course of events, the reader must be told that there was a particular custom linked to the closing of an agreement in ancient Israel. The custom is clearly no longer in use, but the audience is to understand that at that time, it was legally binding. Next, we have question number 6. Describe Boaz's sacrifices for the sake of preserving his relative's reputation in Israel. Is it causing him to be selfless? In Boaz's case, he was the second in line. He was not the only person able to do this by the law, but he was the only one willing to do it. When the first said, "I cannot redeem it," then Boaz happily agreed too. This passage is the culmination of a beautiful story of redemption. Boaz is what we often call a type of Christ. He is a figure in the Old Testament which clearly portrays some aspect of Christ and his relationship to us. The aspect that Boaz portrays is Christ as our Redeemer. There are parallels that we can find in the story. There is only one Redeemer, and they could not both redeem Ruth. Jesus is the only one who is qualified to redeem us. He is the only one who can save us. In the case of Boaz again, he was remembered. He indeed became famous, just like they said in verse 12. Boaz did not do this out of selfish motivations. He was selfless. From the very beginning, he treated Ruth and Naomi with compassion. He selflessly gave what he had, and in the end, God gave him much more blessings than he ever had before. We have the last question. How does the Ruth story teach us important lessons about love and faithfulness? Often, the book of Ruth is described as a love story, but as the story unfolds, we realize that it is about more than the love between two people. It's about God's amazing love for all humankind, specifically His desire for His people to not only experience His love for themselves, but to reach out and display it in such a way that God is made known to His lost, hungry, and hurting children. This story portrays the love and faithfulness Boaz demonstrated for God, who, out of His love for all humankind, commands His people to take care for the poor and thereby make His name known. Boaz and Ruth are a beautiful example of the way that redemption worked in a patriarchal culture. God included the practice of redemption common in ancient Near Eastern culture in His instructions to the Israelites. In so doing, He explained His role as a father or patriarch of all and His desire to redeem family members and the entire creation, restoring them fully in relationship to Him and to each other. Thus, the righteous and faithful character of Boaz is a picture of God Himself in His work of redemption. For Christians, the book of Ruth represents an early sign that the Messiah would liberate all of humankind, not solely Jews, and that Gentiles would join God's community of redeemed people in the mission of restoring God's lost children back into full relationship with Him. Lastly, the book of Ruth showed the Israelites the blessings that obedience could bring. It showed them the loving, faithful nature of their God. This book demonstrates that God responds to His people's cry. He practices what He preaches. Watching Him provide for Naomi and Ruth, two widows with a little prospects for a future, we learn that He cares for the outcasts of society just as He asked us to do. This is from Jeremiah 22:16 and James 1 verse 27. And that's all for today's discussion. Thank you for watching and God bless.